Hi everyone, it's Penny Black and Jill Foster here with a new PB&J card class with some holiday inspiration. And today I'll be sharing with you some really fun techniques for using Penny Black's new Brushstroke stamps. This is from the Penny Black holiday collection called Be Merry, and it has just the most beautiful collection of these big, bold brushstroke stamps that make a great focal point for any card. And I've actually made a set of cards using these stamps, but the technique I'm showing you with the bell stamp, which is seen here, this is Bell and Berries, will work with any of these new stamps. And I just wanted to show you here on screen, this is a list of all the supplies I'll be using on this card, the Penny Black supplies, as well as all the other supplies, inks, the colors, the markers, everything that was used. And this will be shown again at the very end of the video as well. So it'll be right up here on screen at the very end of the video. So to begin, I'm working in my Misty by My Sweet Petunia stamp positioning tool, and I'm using Wendy Vecchi's mini archival ink pads. These are her colors. This is leaf green, and I'll also be using the carnation red. And I found I just love these ink pads for working with these brushstroke stamps, and these two colors are great for Christmas. Here's a comparison of the mini size to the larger size. So it's about 25% of the size of the larger one, which makes it perfect for working with these stamps because the rectangular small size, you can get right in there like I'm doing here onto the small areas and kind of pinpoint exactly where you want those inks to go. So I can take the green and really get it in pretty good on those leaves without having to do any masking. And I also really love this ink on this with these stamps because, as you can see there with that first impression, it really captures the detail of these stamps. And because it is an archival ink, when I go back and add my shading with my watercolors, it is not going to move or blend. So it's going to be permanent once dry, and that makes it much easier to go back in and add the shading. So the color I'm using here is leaf green, and I'm just working a few leaves at a time so that that ink doesn't have time to dry on the stamp, and that's one reason it's very handy to do this in the stamp positioning tool. Now if I get a little bit onto the bell where I don't want it, I just use my finger to swipe that off. You could use a tissue or a baby wipe to do that as well. I am stamping onto Arches hot press watercolor paper. It's 140 pounds. And again, I also found I really liked this paper for stamping with these images and this ink because I can add my watercolors on top, but because it's hot press, it's smoother than a cold press paper. So it is easier to get those details on. I also find personally that it feels a lot more absorbent than the cold press paper that I use. And so the watercolors, I have more control with the painting when I go to add that next step. So as you can see, I've just continued working around, and I kind of turned my my Misty, my stamp positioning tool, so that I could get right in there just handy with my ink pad. Sometimes I use just the very corner of that ink pad on these berries just to line that up. But you can see how that size makes it really easy to get right in there and ink those, and it's just great. These two colors in particular are great colors. I think all of her colors, the Wendy Vecchi colors, in the large ink pads and several now in the minis, and I just love them. They're just nice colors. Now to capture the little branches, I'm going to use a distress marker, and this is in the color Vintage Photo. And I've just chosen this marker because I needed an easy way to get in there and get that little area. So any of your markers that you use with your stamps will work. Now I did use just a little masking here for this bell. So I'm just putting some painter's tape right along that edge. So I mask off those leaves. And that'll just make it easier to apply the ink. And this, for the bell, I'm using shaded lilac distress ink. Now this will not be permanent or archival, but I just wanted to use this large pad, and I especially liked this color for the bell. So I will show you here, and you'll get to see a little later in the video how that does react a bit differently when you go to add your shading on top with water. So you could certainly do the bell with the archival inks as well. So what I'm using as my watercolors are the Distress Ink Re-Inkers, and you just need the tiniest drop, and I'm putting mine just onto an old acrylic block to use as a palette. And again, all the colors that I'm using will be listed at the end of the video on screen, on the video screen. And this is Peeled Paint, Gathered Twigs, Fired Brick, and the blue that I'll be using is Faded Jeans. And I'm just picking that up with a little bit of water, just the tiniest little bit, and painting that right on to the leaves. And here I just discovered that I didn't have the green, which is no problem. I just will have a little bit darker shading right there with the Gathered Twigs. And I'm just adding a bit on top. And what's great is with that stamping, I can kind of see where it should be darker, where the veins of the leaves are, and I can just go right over top of that. And I work sort of leaf by leaf, and I try not to do any that are right next to each other before the other one has had a chance to dry. And it can either air dry or you can dry it with your heat gun. And I add my darker shading in the areas closest to the branch, or if it's a leaf that is underneath another one, that will get darker shading too. And if you're looking for ideas on the shading for these, if you have the packaging for the stamp, that's a really handy way. Just discern, here where there's a lot of green leaves together, to discern where you want to add your darker and lighter shading. And I put down, when I first put that down, I start it where I want it to be darkest, and then I blend it out with water. And here I'm just with that peeled paint. I'm picking that up with the paintbrush, and everything is dry, and just painting in some of those veins. And honestly, you can go by what the stamp tells you to do, or you can just draw some in wherever you want them to be. It's such a subtle detail, and you really can't do it wrong. I'm just painting those in, and I'll continue to do that on all of the leaves. So now I'm going to add just a little additional shading to the berries. And actually, this is the part where I put the wrong color down. I put the Gathered Twigs down instead of the red. But actually, those two work together if you want to have some darker shadows onto the berries. And I follow the same process here as I did with the leaves, working berry by berry, trying not to do two that are touching each other so they don't blend into each other. And if there's any that sort of sit behind the other ones, I try to make those darker along where the two are touching, just to differentiate, like there, between the two. So that one sort of sits behind the one in the center, so that edge is going to be darker. And here on this one, where it sits behind that center one, that edge will be darker. And you can already start to see now how that separates those three. Now to do the blending on the bell, I'm adding some water and also some of the Faded Jeans Distress Re-Inker. Now the color that I stamped, that was done with a distress ink, not an archival ink. So that color underneath is also going to start to sort of lift and blend as I add the water. And I just love these two colors together, the Faded Jeans and the Shaded Lilac that I stamped with. But it's not harder, but there's a little less control when that color underneath starts to blend. So especially for those leaves and those berries, that's why those archival inks are really nice, because things don't just start blending and turning into a blob right away when you add your shading on top with the watercolors. And I can go back up and add more ink where I want it to be darker. You could also do this with traditional watercolors. I have found I really like using this Distress Ink Re-Inkers as a watercolor. They don't feel the same as a watercolor to me. They do feel more like an ink, and I think when they dry, they look more like an ink. than a watercolor, and I find that it just feels like I have a little bit more control with them. So here I'm just adding more of that shading. Now the brushes that I'm using, these are the Silver Black Velvet watercolor brushes, and I did all of this with the number 6, and it's a round brush, so it has a very fine tip, so you can do from pretty large areas into nice small areas like on this bell and the trim and the berries, and I also have that listed at the end of the video. You can see though that this stamped image is just, it's pretty simple to shade and paint, but it is such a bold statement when you're done. Now for that little star that sort of blended out as I was painting, I'm just going in now with another distress marker with the fine tip point, and this color is Chip Sapphire, and I'm just tracing around that upper right hand detail and then added right back on top the lower left. There was enough there that all I had to do was just trace it. And for a little bit more shading and definition on the branch, I'm going back with that same distress marker that I colored on my stamp with, the vintage photo, and I'm just coloring in a few places, darkening up a few areas. And that just finishes things off really nicely. Now, I went ahead and stamped this same stamp onto Eclipse masking paper, and I fussy cut that out. And I didn't fussy cut all the berries, and just enough so that most of it was covered, especially along the edges where I'll be applying the painter's tape mask. And I used this on another project. I've used this twice, and so it's not quite sticking as well because it's been used multiple times, but I always like to save these masks so that you can reuse them. So I didn't bother with any of the little fiddly parts, the little branches, and even a couple of those berries that were hanging down there. I didn't worry about that. Or there's one area where it's real close in between them all. I just left that there. So I'm kind of lazy about fussy cutting, but it works out. So now I'm going to, everything is dry, of course, before I even put that mask on. And now I'm going to use an ink blending tool and a foam pad to add Gathered Twigs Distress Ink. And I'm putting it on pretty lightly and making sure I really get around those edges of the painter's tape masking. And I don't have any trouble pulling up my painter's tape and having it tear any part of the background. But if you do, if yours is just a little bit stickier, or maybe it's more humid or something here that impacts that, one thing you can do is just pat it onto your shirt or your pants just to remove some of the stickiness, and you get a little fuzzies from your clothes on there, and that makes it easier to remove. Now that I finished the Gathered Twigs, I'm going to add just a touch of Wild Honey Distress Ink. And I love the way that these two colors work together. That little bit of Wild Honey just warms that up in the background. Now I'm going to put this piece, still with all the masks in place, into my stamp positioning tool. And I will be using my very well loved stamp from Penny Black. It's a text stamp, and the set is called Footnotes. As you can see, mine is like black. I've used it so much. Now this is another Wendy Vecchi color. This is called, let's see here, Orange Blossom. This is the full-sized ink pad, and I am inking up that stamp and just kind of stamping in the areas where it's open. So when I lay it onto my project, I kind of keep my hand behind the stamp positioning tool. That helps me know where to put the ink. I'm not looking for a perfect impression here, just little bits here and there to give it a vintage look. Now here's probably my favorite part of the whole thing, is pulling off all these masks. This is a great one-layer design, especially for Christmas cards. If you're mailing a lot, it's easy to pop into the mail. And that little bit where I didn't want to worry about fussy cutting, I'm just going to add a little ink right there. And here's an area where some of that red sort of bled out a little bit on the berry, and I'm just taking a white gel pen, and you can totally hide it. So don't worry, don't start over if something like that happens to you. And all I did was add a die cut sentiment and added this to a note card, and the card was complete. And I just had such a blast making this whole set of cards using this same technique. And I wanted to share those with you here. This one features Holly Sprig, and you can see the other Penny Black product numbers used on this card on screen in light gray. To add another detail on this, I used my white gel pen while everything was masked around the outer edges and just added some snow. This is the new brushstroke stamp called Amaryllis. This one is so beautiful. It's really great to work with. I did add a little bit of extra shading on this one using a colored pencil. Here is Adornments. And if you're looking for a watercolor look that's really easy to achieve, this is a great stamp for that. The shading is kind of built in once you stamp it. It really lets you know where to leave those highlights and where to make it darker. This is the new brushstroke stamp called Red Delight. And to embellish this one, I also added just a few little tiny die cut snowflakes with some pearls. So if you're looking for something a little extra to add to this style of card, you can do that. This card also has some sequins on it. This is actually an older stamp, and this one too, but I was having such a blast with this technique that I pulled these out and also made some cards with the red star. That's another great poinsettia stamp if you're looking for some brushstroke, no-line watercolor look. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can also connect with Penny Black on Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as our blog and website. And I've linked to all of those for you down in the YouTube description box below. And as promised, here is that supply list from all of the supplies used on the card we made today. Thanks for watching.